Today on a special crossover edition of Locked On Canadiens, we have a special guest and we're going to talk about this year's Blue Jackets, last year's Habs, plus predictions for the game and all that coming up on today's Locked On Canadiens.
Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 727 of Locked On Canadiens. It is a special crossover with the lovely and talented Jay Forster from Locked On Blue Jackets, one of my favorite people on the entire hockey internet, also in real life, but we didn't get a chance to meet in real life. But before we get into all of our hockey talk, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day or your first watch on YouTube. And you remember you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and hit that bell on YouTube so you get notifications every time we go live, every time we put up an episode. Thank you so much. In the meantime, let me welcome my beautiful guest all the way from the United Kingdom, Jay Forster of Locked On Blue Jackets. Jay, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for coming on Locked On Blue Jackets as well. I guess since this is going to be airing on both feeds, this should be a fun game tonight.
It's going to be a defense optional game, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it feels like. Defense optional, goaltending optional. Everybody else is injured. So let's get into that. I'd like to ask about the Blue Jackets to start because every time I turn around, Jay, another player on this Blue Jackets roster is injured. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you tell me who are the injured players right now that are either on short-term, day-to-day, or long-term?
God, okay. Let's see if I can do this. So, Justin Danforth is out for the season. He had surgery to repair a torn labrum. Adam Boquist has a broken foot, excuse me. Nick Blankenberg has a broken ankle. Zach Werenski is out for the season. He separated his shoulder and tore his labrum. Patrik Laine is out with an ankle sprain. Who am I missing? Last night, or not last night, we're recording this on Wednesday, Tuesday night versus the Flyers. Jake Bean left the game early due to injury. Elvis Merzlikins left the game early due to injury. And we also, Emil Bemstrom has been, he missed practice today or yesterday, Wednesday. He is one of the quote-unquote walking wounded. And Jake Voracek is also out indefinitely. I believe that is everyone as of right now.
So essentially, you and I are going to suit up for the Blue Jackets in Columbus.
I think actually
tonight.
I am on the second defense pairing for tonight's game. I think is the depth chart.
I mean, it's honestly horrific injury luck, but our listeners will not be new to this, right? The Canadiens had that, maybe not all at the same time in the same 3-week span, but there were a lot of injuries on the Canadiens team. I think it's very simplistic to say that, are this year's Blue Jackets last year's Habs, because there obviously isn't the same coaching issue at play. And I believe that the Blue Jackets had, I want to say, a much better offseason than the Canadiens had. I mean, I do think that there was a big question mark signing, but they also got one of the most prized free agents on the market. So this was definitely a team that was trying to take steps forward. They definitely have a lot of young, exciting players that they've picked recently that have, started to make the team or are poised to make the team. So the future was looking good, and then the actual season started.
Yeah, I think the thing about the Blue Jackets is sometimes if you pay too much attention to them, they panic and they're like, no, please don't perceive us, which is deeply relatable, but also not ideal for a professional sports team. They kind of, it's weirdly reminiscent of the 2015-2016 season where they they did that massive trade for Brandon Saad from the Blackhawks. And everyone was like, man, this is going to be great. They had a monster preseason. Their top line was Brandon Saad, Ryan Johansson, who just had a 70-point season, Nick Foligno, who just had like a 35-goal season, got named captain. That was their top line. Everyone was like, man, they're going to run the division this season. And then they lost 8 games in a row to start the season and never really picked it back up. And unfortunately, the Blue Jackets haven't been that bad, but it's been a rough start to the season. The goaltending hasn't been where it needed to be. The defense, arguably, the defense got worse because for some reason we're paying $4 million to Eric Branson for the next 4 years instead of playing literally any of our young puck moving defensemen that like do what they're supposed to instead of taking dumb penalties and getting caved in on shot attempts. But the offense, I think, is the surprising thing. For me, I was expecting the Blue Jackets to basically do the Edmonton Oilers thing of, we don't need defense, we don't need goaltending, we're just going to outscore the opponent. You know, Johnny Gaudreau came in, had 115 points last season. Patrik Laine, I still think, could be a 40-goal scorer in this league, potentially a 50-goal scorer in this league, if he can stay healthy. He's been out. This is his second injury of the season. He sprained his elbow in the first game of the season, and now he sprained his ankle. So he's played like 7 games of the Blue Jackets' 14 so far. And I don't think he's been 100% for all of those games. I think he came back too early because he wanted to play in Finland, which is understandable, but also stupid. And it's been a struggle every game apart from a handful. Like, I think every game apart from maybe 3 games has felt like pulling teeth for this team. You know, it's not necessarily that they've been bad. It's that it's just been painful to watch. Even when they're winning, sometimes it's like they're trying their best to make me hate them.
You know what? That sounds familiar. I mean, in that case, they're probably like last year's Habs. Like that's
Hey,
definitely.
if they end up bottom of the league and winning the draft lottery, like I will take it. I will take this horrible, awful season like 10 times over if it means that we can pick first in the draft lottery.
I do think that's kind of, that was the case. That was a saving grace last year of the Canadiens being really not great was, they ended up with the first overall pick. Obviously, depending on where you sit, this year's draft core or draft class is apparently so much better than last year's. But I do think that, every year people say that, but I do feel that like up top in that top 5, top 7, this year does feel a bit more promising than last year was. It's just them's the breaks, right? Like you tanked in the wrong season or things fell apart in the wrong season. So, Jay, because you are one of my favorite people, I do want this for you, but I also want this for me. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Canadiens and if there's any chance of this happening to the Canadiens or if they can get back into contention for the Bedard sweepstakes, I'm going to call it. And so Jay is going to grill me on the Canadiens, and hopefully, my multiple weeks away from Montreal have not clouded that. That's all coming up in just one moment. But real quick, this episode is brought to you by betonline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball to soccer and esports, we've got it all at betonline.net. And the World Cup is coming up. Remember that. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. And we know you do because you're listening to this show. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right. Where does the Montreal Canadiens game start? Jay, what are your questions for me about this team that I have seen only half of due to being away for work and vacation?
I mean, so I took a quick peek at the Canadiens stats. And like you said, they are doing better than expected. How much of that is due to goaltending? And how much of that is due to the fact that Cole Caufield is an unstoppable goal-scoring machine?
I think you hit the nail right on the head on both those points. Both of Montreal's goalies are playing better than you would expect them to, better than their average. They are playing above, whatever you want to call it. They're playing better than their ability. And it's really good to see, to be honest. Like last season, both of these players had really tough luck with injuries. Samuel Montembeault was playing with an injured wrist. Jake Allen just kept getting injured every 5 minutes. he was obviously being relied on too much. So the Canadiens kind of, with who they have in net right now, they are riding that. Like, I'm seeing enough wins, they are taking advantage of that positive like a positive uptick in goaltending. You mentioned the underlying numbers. You mentioned in the previous segment that you were talking about, the Blue Jackets seem to be doing everything they possibly can to make me hate them. The Canadiens, despite being, if you look at the underlying numbers, there's a lot of coming back down to earth. There's a lot of tempering expectations. Like, when you're watching them on the ice, they're doing everything they can to make you like them. You're watching this team and they're being exciting. They're playing with this enthusiasm for the game, which we didn't see last year. And you're watching these young players try to take strides forward. You're watching the coaching staff. I mean, I do have questions for the coaching staff, as everyone does. Like, Martin St. Louis is not perfect, even though there was a pretty long honeymoon period with him. And I do still think that he's a phenomenal coach with what he's been able to get this team to do. But you look at the roster and you look at the underlying numbers, and this team has a lot of issues defensively, and they only have one real true scoring line. I mean, they need more secondary scoring. So you're looking at Cole Caufield, and yes, he is an unstoppable force, but he's also playing with Nick Suzuki. And once they brought Kirby Dach to that line, it made a huge difference. Like, you're watching that, it is like, if you look at the underlying numbers of that line alone since they've been playing together, they've had one bad game, and it was the last game that we watched, right? It was against New Jersey. I'm sorry, New Jersey. I forgot you exist, with good reason. But you watch that, and like, the Nick Suzuki line was not good in that game. And then their entire team like had a bad game as a result, right? Like, the way that line goes just generally tends to sort of dictate how the rest of the game went. And they had a pretty good first period against New Jersey. It was just the rest of it that, they just allowed it to fall apart. And I was watching that first line get hemmed in the defensive zone a lot. So obviously, in a perfect world, that is your scoring line, and you've got secondary scoring, and you can spread out the tougher assignments throughout your roster, which you can't really do right now. Like, the Canadiens have kind of a mishmash of forwards that they're trying to get rid of, some guys that are trying to prove themselves, some filler, and then some guys that'll be here for a long time. They're also, I think, not sure how to play certain players. Like, I feel like, for example, Slavkovsky's not getting enough minutes, right? We talked in our last episode. Should he be sent down to Laval? And I will tell you, our commenters did not agree with this idea, but we just brought it up because, it is a debate that's going on in Montreal. Like, we're not the only people to ask the question, but he is not playing enough minutes. He's not playing enough situations. He's not playing enough minutes. Obviously, he's been suspended as well. That's a key part of this puzzle. But I find that, they're really taking their time with him. So if you're going to assume that that's what they're going to continue to do with him, like, a lot of these forward lines are a question mark. We thought the defense would be a question mark. The forward lines are starting to be a question mark too. Like, and then you'll see that, for example, somebody like Sean Monahan has found some chemistry with either Dodonov or Dvorak, like, depending on where they're playing. Like, there have been moments of promise or bright spots, but you look at the team overall and you can just tell that the offense is not that deep yet. So when you put everything on, and that first line is really good, like, in a perfect world where, like, they can keep the opponents guessing and they can line match a little bit better, that's the line that's going to kill you. That's the line that you're going to want to defend against. And so the Canadiens need to bring up some more scoring. And there's a lot of talk in Montreal about Brendan Gallagher. Is he washed up? Is it time for him to go? Is he bringing it back? All of that. I think that if you're looking towards the future, like, you will see Cole Caufield, Nick Suzuki, and Kirby Dach on this team. But those other guys that I mentioned, Sean Monahan, probably not. Christian Dvorak, maybe, but probably not. Somebody like, Dodonov, like, I would say it's a pretty safe bet. And we haven't even talked about Josh Anderson yet, but I think it's pretty fair to say that he's probably not going to be around either. Brendan Gallagher, not when they're contending, I don't think. I think, he might not be on his way out of Montreal throughout this contract, but I don't think he's going to still be on this team when they're ready to start making the playoffs and making noise.
Yeah. So you talked about line matching a little bit there, and the Montreal Canadiens coaching has been such a great story. I think, you saw that switch flip when they got rid of Ducharme and brought in Martin St. Louis, who everyone was like, this guy's coaching, like, junior A high school hockey in Canada. What does he know about coaching an NHL team? And it turns out that maybe you don't need to be the most qualified person. Like, did it surprise you how he came in and suddenly the team just started picking themselves up? Like, is he naturally a good coach, or is it just that he is one of those kind of guys that, like, I feel like I probably would run through a wall if Martin St. Louis motivated me to do so? Is it his personality, or do you think it is that he's just kind of like a natural at coaching that's given this team kind of an identity, I guess?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the good thing about Martin St. Louis is that he knows the effect that he has on these players, right? Like you see the way that he deals with Cole Caufield, for example. He mentions himself, he wants his players to have fun. He wants his players to loosen up. He wants them to learn from their mistakes. He wants them to get better instincts, reads. He talks about reads. He talks about situations. He doesn't like the word strategy as much. He doesn't like structure. He likes to have like what I would say is like habits, right? Like he wants to build good habits on the team. It's kind of like honing in on the talents of each player and kind of bringing out the best in them. But I also know from everything that was said when he was hired by Jeff Gorton, by Kent Hughes, about what a big hockey nerd he is. Like there's so much talk about like you could spend 3 hours at dinner with him and all he'll do is talk about hockey and like the intricacies and the strategies and the on ice situations and all of that. So he definitely has that mind. He has that passion. He has that hockey nerdery, right? He's a huge hockey nerd. And it doesn't always translate. So you have that ability to think the game, but also communicate the game with your players. There are plenty of people that are really smart that can't be coaches. They're really good at hockey knowledge and hockey sense and hockey insight. They can't be coaches because they don't have that personality. And then there's plenty of people that have that personality and can make you run through a wall, but they might not know what you need to do when you're on the ice. So I think Martin St. Louis has been the perfect mix. Again, like there's questions that I have about some of his decisions, but you have to remember, like, it hasn't even been a full year that he's coached in the NHL. It's essentially been half a year at this point. So I do think that it is a combination of both. I think the Canadiens are in a good situation. It's interesting to see how it evolves because right now, all of the front office plus the coaching staff has a lot of rope. There's a lot of room to make mistakes right now because we're looking at a future where the team will contend. My question is going to be when they are contending, when they're playing against the top teams in the NHL and trying to beat them in the playoffs or trying to make the playoffs, all of that. My question is, in those situations, will I still feel the same way about this coaching staff? And right now I feel optimistic.
Honestly, at this point, sometimes you just got to take optimism. I said all off season, the Blue Jackets don't necessarily have to be good this year. I would like it if they are fun, though. And sometimes fun is all you can ask for. Like you said, the Canadiens, do they always play perfect hockey? No, but for the most part, from what I've seen this season, from what I've seen, from what you're talking about, your co-host Scott, what he's talked about is that it's fun to watch this team again, and sometimes that's all you can do. But speaking of watching teams, we should talk about tonight's game. So in a minute, we are going to, I think, do some keys to the game. I'm going to make Laura make some predictions because I love to make crazy predictions. But before we do that, I want to thank everyone for making Locked On Blue Jackets and Locked On Canadiens your first listen every day, and especially today. So make sure your second listen is Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sport, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today is available on this app, on YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So, Laura, what do the Montreal Canadiens have to do to win this game? What is the one thing that they have to do to win this game?
I think, honestly, taking advantage of the goaltending slump right now. That's to me is throw everything at the goaltender. Whether it's haphazard, whether it's strategized, whether it's positive, that's what they need to do. Here's the question: like, are they trying to win the game, or are they trying to continue on building good habits in this team? Because like, if they want to win the game, they can make it one of those crazy garbage goal, like all kinds of like event, like when you say high event hockey, that's not what you usually mean. Like, you don't usually mean shenanigans. Like, this is what I expect would happen. But I think honestly, like throwing everything at the goaltending. I know you talked a little bit about how you have question marks about the Blue Jackets defense. I think the Canadians have enough intelligence in their forward core to sort of outwork a defense, to outmaneuver a defense. Not all the time, but they can do it, right? Like, if your defense isn't up to par, I think that the forward core that they have is pretty good. Like, all the players that I mentioned, somebody like Sean Monahan, for example, somebody like Christian Dvorak, like these guys have a really good hockey IQ. They're able to think the game really well. Whereas, you know, somebody like Mike Hoffman, for example, doesn't. He's a one-trick pony. And I don't want to be too hard on Mike Hoffman. He's been doing really well the last like week or so. Uh, he doesn't necessarily have that, but he can complete a line or a play, right? So if your defense is struggling, that the Canadians can take advantage of that. And again, struggling, like, because what they're not world beating, right? They need to just make sure that they control puck possession, because once you're in their zone, it's a little bit dicey. Like, the defense is partly injured, partly inexperienced, partly kind of a who is that guy? So they do need to, they do need to stay out of that zone. And especially like if like I talked about in the previous segment, right? That first line can't get hemmed into their own zone. Like that, they can't let that happen. So they need to be careful and they need to keep the game in the Columbus zone, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will say I've been doing some math on average experience for defensemen as the injuries go through. And I haven't done the math for the current crop of healthy defensemen, but with Jake Bean in the lineup, the average career games for the Blue Jackets defense was, I think, 170 games on average. And that's with Gabranson in, who missed the last couple of games, who missed one game, I think, due to injury. If you
That
take
is
him out,
so low.
it drops to 90 games on average. The Blue Jackets currently have two healthy defensemen that have played over 150 NHL games.
That is blowing my mind right now.
We've got one guy, Jake Christensen, I think is up to 10 NHL games now. Marcus Bjork just played in his second NHL game on Tuesday. Like, Jake Bean, I think, had about 125 games. He's just gone down to injury. At the minute, it's Eric Gabranson, Vladislav Gavrikov, who played 28 minutes on Tuesday night, which is bonkers, and children. That's the defensive core right now. It's very, very stressful. So honestly, there might be a worse strategy than just throwing everything at the net and hoping that the defense collapses, because it's children.
They could collapse. And that reminds me of, like, we had this one game last year where Alexander Romanov was the most tenured
Oh
defenseman.
no.
We've got some young guys. We've got, Caden Gooley, one of my favorite people to talk about. We've got Arbor Jacki, one of the community's favorite people to talk about. We've got some young guys on defense in the Habs. Mike Matheson, they're talking about him being ready to return. As of this recording, I'm not 100% sure of his status. But yeah, he hasn't played yet. Edmondson has come back and is showing a little bit of rust. But Canadians decor is kind of a mishmash. It's a little bit weird, but I will say that Caden Gooley has been a revelation so far.
Yes, I've heard nothing but good things about Caden Gooley, and also mostly good things about Arbor Jacki. He's an experience, I think.
Yes,
Um,
he's
Big
worth
fan
a
of him,
ticket.
like, when he's not playing my team. So, um, before we wrap up, let's do some predictions. I always make people do some predictions if we do a game crossover. So I want to know what you think the final score is going to be, and I want to know who is going to open the scoring for the Canadiens.
I think the final score is going to be 5-3 to the Montreal Canadiens. It's going to be a ridiculous game, and the first goal is going to go to Kirby Dach. That's who I'm predicting. What about you? Your turn.
See, I was thinking, like, honestly, this has all of the makings of it's either going to be like a 6-5 shootout game, or it's going to be like a 2-1 regulation game. And I don't know which way it's going to go yet. It could go either way. I think I'm leaning towards the Blue Jackets in overtime, 6-5. And I think They don't have any French Canadians on the team at the minute. Normally, I would pick a French Canadian just because they love to score in Montreal.
We do.
All of our French Canadians have gone elsewhere, I believe. So I am going to say that the scoring is going to open with a I'm going to say Kent Johnson opens the scoring. He's been doing real well. He's not as flashy as some of the other rookies this season, but he's holding his own and he looks really good out there. And you can see that he's putting it together. And when he figures it out, I do think he's just gonna go like that. So that is my pick. 6-5 Blue Jackets in overtime. Kent Johnson opening the scoring.
One last question. How many penalties do you think the Canadiens take against the Blue Jackets?
Oh, man. I'm going to go 4 minor penalties.
Okay. I'm going to go a little bit higher than that.
Have they
I
been
don't
doing
know
a lot
who's
of crime
refereeing the
recently?
game, so take this with a grain of salt. I'm thinking 7 penalties. I don't know why.
7. Oh my
I have
God.
this feeling that it's going to be
The
one of
problem
those
is
circus games.
the problem is that they don't like to call penalties against the Blue Jackets. Blue Jackets cannot buy a call at the minute. They're like the least. They're like the team that has had the least penalties drawn so far this season, I believe. So if they get more than 4, I'll be amazed.
Okay. We're not going to bet on this because that is kind of Scott's job. Speaking of Scott, he will be back tomorrow. Please pay no attention to the fact that whenever Scott is on the show, Jay is not, and vice
No,
versa.
it's fine. People have definitely seen Scott and I in the same room. We're definitely not the same person.
I mean, I can't. I can't.
No, I don't.
The evidence is sitting right in front of me.
Don't
Like,
pay no attention to that. It's fine. I'm sure Scott and I are actually 2 different people. This is a real
Totally.
accent, I promise.
Totally. And so Scott will be back tomorrow. We will be recapping the Blue Jackets game. And do not forget the mailbag. You can email us at lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. That is actually now my preferred way of getting mailbag questions because it's just so hard to corral all of them. But you can still put your mailbag questions in the YouTube comments. You can also tweet them at LO_Canadians. We will also accept them via direct message on Twitter until Twitter explodes in a giant ball of fire. Jay, please tell people where they can find you, your podcast, and your work right now before, again, Twitter explodes in giant ball of fire.
Yes. Well, as long as Twitter exists, you can find me at _Jacob Foster, JAKOBFORSTER. If you're watching on YouTube, it's at the bottom of the screen. You can find the show at LO_Blue Jackets. I can't in good conscience recommend paying attention to the Blue Jackets at the minute because I think if you pay any more attention to them, they will just explode and every other defenseman will die. But you can find Locked on Blue Jackets wherever you get Locked on Canadiens. We are on every podcast app and also over on YouTube.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and we will be back tomorrow.